Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, my name is Stephen Barr. I'm the president of the Society of Catholic Scientists. This is an organization that began in the summer of 2016 and has grown to over 1,000 scientists around the world. We had our third annual conference in June, early June this year, at the University of Notre Dame. One of the presenters at the conference was Dr. Thomas Sheahen, who gave a very interesting presentation about time and God's knowledge of and relationship to time. And so I'm going to first introduce or have Dr. Sheahen introduce himself, and then we're going to discuss the presentation he gave at our conference. So Dr. Sheahen, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Certainly. Thank you, Stephen. Yes, I'm Tom Sheahen, and I'm the director of the Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology. So that's quite a long title. We go by our acronym, which is ITEST, or ITEST, and everyone knows us that way. And ITEST has been around for 50 years, founded by Father Brungs right after Vatican II. What we tried to do in all those years is tell people that science and faith are compatible, that there's no obstacle, no opposition. And that's the kind of bumper sticker length of what we do. In the particular case of this presentation for the Science Society of Catholic Scientists, what I was trying to do is bring people's attention to another human limitation. So the title of the talk was entitled Everywhen. That's a word you haven't heard. It's a word that doesn't fit in the vocabulary. You can't use the word in Scrabble. It's not a legitimate word. What does everywhen mean? Sounds like everywhere. But this is the theme of my talk, is to examine the question of what these things mean. We believe that God is omnipresent, but we don't really understand that. And what I've done in this talk is to turn this idea of everywhen into a close look at the limited way human beings have to perceive space and time, which is vastly inferior to God's way.
This presentation you gave at our conference was particularly interesting to me because I'm a physicist. I guess I forgot to say that when introducing myself. I am myself a theoretical particle physicist, and so deal all the time with the theory of relativity and space and time and the structure of space and time. So I was particularly interested in your talk. So the title was Everywhen, Examining Omnipresence, and the subtitle was On the Limited Human Perception of Space and Time. So in particular, what do you mean? Tell us more about human limitations. In what ways is human perception of time limited, and is God limited in the same way?
Well, specifically, we as human beings always have this sequential notion of time. Time's one directional; it only keeps going. It's a background thing for us. It's just there. We have to deal with it. But on the other hand, God, who transcends and is above space and time, is not similarly limited. We as humans can understand up, down, left, right, backward, forward. We can handle 3 dimensions of space okay. But the idea of handling time as a dimension as well as space is something that we can only do through the mathematics of physics, specifically theory of relativity, and we don't really grasp the connection there between our own knowledge, our own perception, and our own limitations. Well, when we try to apply that kind of thinking to God, we get a completely wrong impression of God. And that really gets in the way of our understanding of God.
Right. And so we are sort of immersed in time, right? And our thoughts our thoughts unfold in time. So at any one moment we're sort of perceiving sort of one slice, right? So we, like everything else in the physical world, sort of march through time. But does God?
Exactly so. Yes.
Does God sort of march through time in the same way?
No, that is the whole point, is that God is over and above, transcends, outside of time, and God, shall I say, he perceives or has a perception of time? Not exactly. He doesn't have to perceive in the idea of getting sensory data and figure it out. He just knows. God is present to time. And that is a tremendous capability on God's part, and is emphatically not limited, and emphatically not similar to the way human beings are limited. So that's
right.
A huge distinction that humans often fail to grasp.
Right, and we're also we're temporal creatures ourselves. We are marching through time, but we're also located at one place in space, and whereas God is everywhere, right? Omnipresent in space, right?
That is exactly true, and we as humans have long acknowledged that God is everywhere. I mean, this is, there was a time when everybody thought the Earth was the center of the universe, but in recent centuries we've fully grasped the idea that God is everywhere. And nobody has any problem with that idea. But the idea that God is everywhen, people don't even know what that means, because the word is a puzzle in itself. Everywhen, what can that possibly mean? Because the reason we ask the question is we humans are not capable of everywhen. We see time sequentially.
Right. Now, as a physicist, it's very clear that human beings are limited in the way in which we perceive space. So we sort of evolved, or our brains are only able to, for example, perceive 3 space dimensions. But in my field of physics, we talk about space possibly having more than 3 dimensions, but we're not able to visualize more than 3 space dimensions. So we're very the way we think about things is very limited by our senses and our imaginations, even when it comes to space, but even more with time, I would think.
Well, this is quite true. We basically live in a world of limitations where we don't recognize our own boundaries. Yes, we can look out into space and see, distant galaxies and so forth, and then say, oh, gee, we're stuck on this planet. I don't mean that. What I mean about the boundaries is that our conceptual processes, our manner of thinking, and the language in which we express thoughts does not include the capability of grasping all time at once. It just isn't there in our fundamental makeup and structure of the way we think. Right.
And so I noticed that you were, in your talk, in your presentation, you were talking about time and space appearing in the equations of physics in a symmetric way. So first, could you say something about the fact that physics looks at things on the basis of mathematics, and what is meant by symmetry, because that's a very important element of your presentation, the notion of symmetry.
Right. Yeah. I think the first person to really insist upon the importance of mathematics as a representation of nature was probably Galileo, but over the centuries, people have definitely all gone along with that. And when we think about nature, first of all, it makes sense. It's worth studying. That's a cornerstone Christianity principle from thousands of years ago. But in particular, the idea of mathematics as the key to expressing what's going on in science, physics in particular, is pretty much ingrained in our way of thinking. So we basically have a mathematical trust, and in particular, the form of mathematics we like best is symmetry. It shouldn't matter.
The mathematics, didn't Galileo? You mentioned Galileo, and I think you're right. Though mathematics had been used in science previously, it was really Galileo and the people, 400 years ago, not just Galileo, who realized how deeply mathematical the world is. And didn't he say that God wrote two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature, and that the book of nature is written in mathematics?
That is a famous quote of his. That is true, yeah. And that trust in mathematics has been a cornerstone of the profession of physics for the 400 years since.
Right.
And if we look at what equations seem good, those that are based on symmetry are the best, the most plausible, the most reasonable, the ones we trust, because symmetry is a cornerstone of mathematical thinking as applied to physics.
Right.
If you have symmetry, then it's good.
So what is symmetry? What does the word symmetry mean? Because not everybody, it's used in a special way or by mathematicians and physicists that may not be too familiar with the people who are not in those fields. So what do we mean by symmetry here?
Okay, your equations have to have certain properties that do not change when you make certain changes in the equations.
Right.
Let's suppose that you're doing an experiment in Chicago. That experimental result had darn well better be the same if you're doing the same experiment in Atlanta.
Right.
If your clock is set to the Eastern time zone, you better get the same result as in the Pacific time zone.
Right.
That's the first I spoke of is what we call spatial symmetry. The second is time symmetry. But there are other symmetries too. If you're looking at a sphere, you should be able to look at it from top, bottom, left, right, and it always looks the same. Well, the equations are supposed to be like that too. You want an equation which, when you do what's called a transformation on it, winds up looking the same.
Right.
And that is the key to symmetry in mathematical equations, is
right.
You keep getting the sameness even though you have changed your perspective, your looking, your time zone, your city, or whatever, you still produce the same result. That's symmetry.
Right. So, I guess what the mathematician would say is if you transform something in a certain way and it ends up looking just as it did before, that transformation is a symmetry. So maybe an example that people could latch on.
Exactly true.
If you had a square, a perfect square, and you rotate it by 90 degrees, it will look just the same as it did before. And or if you, as you said, a sphere, if you rotate it, it looks just the same because it has this symmetry.
Exactly.
Another one that people might appreciate, if some our faces, if you interchange left and right, somebody who had a perfectly symmetric face would look the same if you reflected his face as in a mirror. Though most people aren't exactly symmetric. One eye might be a little bigger than the other, and so on. And we say they're not symmetric. So as you said,
yes, the examples you've given are perfect. They are exactly descriptions of what symmetry means. So
you're saying that equations, and this is something that probably would be, people can understand the symmetry of an object like a ball, spherical ball, or a square. But these very abstract, these equations can have symmetries, you're saying. And so that if I take a physical situation, as you said, over here, and I transform everything by moving everything over there, the same equations should work, right? It doesn't matter. The same laws of physics apply in New York and Moscow, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right. Or the same laws of physics should apply today and tomorrow and a week from now. And those are, so the equations, even though you've transformed by going shifting from today to, say, a week from now, the equations don't look any different, so that's a kind of symmetry of the equations.
Exactly so.
Okay. So symmetry, you talk about symmetry in the equations, and so you mentioned a few of them, time translation, as it's called, spatial translation, and so on. Also rotation in space. So if you take everything, your whole experiment, and sort of rotate it, at least in most situations, it should make a difference. Like all directions in space are kind of are sort of created equal, to put it in Jeffersonian terms.
Yeah, it is. I remember early on as an undergraduate, I was trying to do this quiz problem in electricity, moving charged particles.
Uh-huh.
And to write out the most general equation, I threw in the term of gravity acting upon the electron.
Uh-huh.
And the professor came along and put a big X through it, because I should have had enough sense to realize that the force of gravity compared to electromagnetism is so minor, so tiny, that it wasn't going to make any difference. So the idea was I should have ignored that little tiny thing and just paid attention to the symmetric problem that had to do with the moving electrical particles. So I learned that fairly early, that your symmetries that you call almost perfect are always approximations, but they're very good approximations, and they really do give you the answer to a high degree of precision.
Well, even there, I think physicists believe that some symmetries are probably exact. I think what you're saying is, if I understand correctly, that if I'm doing an experiment on the surface of the Earth, there's a difference between sideways and down because of gravity. But that's just because the Earth happens to be here. If we were doing the same experiment out in empty space, in interstellar space, very far from Earth or from any other, star or planet or something, all the directions of space in and of themselves are kind of equivalent, right? There's no...
Exactly so, yeah.
Nature does not have a favorite direction in space. But if you're doing something near the Earth, then of course the Earth is it's gonna make a difference. It's gonna set up particular directions, like towards the Earth or away from the Earth.
Yeah. But anyway, the
time and space are kind of symmetric too. This is an important point. There is this symmetry that involves a similarity between space and time that is terribly important, that they appear in the same way in equations and in the way they affect objects like stars moving in space, etc. They also appear in this unified, combined way, which, when you look at it from the point of view of seeking symmetry, the symmetry is there, and we like that. Physicists believe in symmetry. It's an article of faith. Right.
And if the symmetry isn't there, then you start wondering whether you're on the right track or not, because you expect
one of your
symmetry.
Slides from your talk, you say that according to relativity, Einstein's theory of relativity, space, the three dimensions of space and the one dimension of time fit together to form a four-dimensional manifold. So that's a term you use on one of your slides. So Einstein says space and time are really four dimensions, three of space and one of time. Was that true in Newtonian physics? The pre-Einstein physics.
No, and that's an important difference. Newton looked at the three dimensions of space, and he looked at time as something totally different. The calculus was about how things move through time, and there was no connection between space and time. There was the fact that things are in space, they move in time, and that was what classical mechanics was all about. Right. The symmetry between space and time really just developed in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and really the leader of that field was obviously Einstein, the guy who did the most work.
So he showed that time is not out there by itself, unrelated to space. So Newton, time and space had nothing to do with each other. But Einstein says no. There are three space and dimensions, one time, and they're actually fit together in one thing, and there's symmetries relating space and time, right? So what is the symmetry? There's a name for the symmetries that sort of relate space and time.
Well, we have, I think we use the term Lorentz invariance,
right,
which says that it will not vary, it will be invariant, under a so-called Lorentz transformation, which is a way of, shuffling, interchanging, twisting, combining space and time, moving space partially into time or time into space.
Right.
That is what's called the Lorentz transformation, and a correct physics equation has got to have Lorentz invariance.
Right. So it's sort of like an analogous to rotations in space, right? I mean,
exactly so. Very analogous. Very
right.
analogous indeed.
If I'm standing here, I might describe something and say, oh, that's in front of me. But somebody is standing in a different sort of, his body is rotated relative to mine. He might say, that same object, he say, that's over to my side. And so I say front, he said side, but front and side can be sort of rotated into each other. If it's in my front of me, I can turn my body, and now it's to my side. And that's
right.
In the same way in relativity, somebody may say this thing is pointing sort of relative to me in a time direction, but to some other frame of reference. It could be partly in the time direction, partly in a space direction, right? It's just sort of rotated in space. Exactly
so, and that's where we get a number of things that are real in physics, like the redshift of distant galaxies, and also we get a lot of science fiction about space travel, where the principle of switching space into time back and forth is exploited, first in real physics and then in science fiction.
But space and time are space and time are sort of in relativity almost on the same footing. They're sort of tied.
Exactly. That is it. Perfect word. Same footing. Yes.
And so we don't say we now say space time as if it's like one thing.
We do.
Space time. So what does that have? So tell us what. So that has something to do with God and you.
Okay. Well,
God understands time or sees time.
Yeah. What we have to do really, first of all, is that we say, look, guys, if we humans can understand something, you can bet your bottom dollar that God understands it too. Okay, that is a given right from the beginning. That God knows every theory that we know, and so the idea, as we've written down in General Relativity, that time and space are this manifold, this united way of thinking of things, that's perfectly comprehensible to God. He doesn't have any trouble with it. But his omnipresence extends to time as well as to space. So yes, he's everywhere. And we've agreed on that for centuries. But he's also everywhen, because he comprehends all time. I hate to say the word at once, because that introduces time, but he comprehends all of space and time together, and that's something we can't do. So we've got a pretty good theory, relativity, and God understands it better than we do.
Right.
And that's a very essential point.
Right. I mean, we don't understand everything at once. I mean, because we understand piecemeal, right? I mean, I understand something now. I might be thinking about the Pythagorean theorem now, but 5 minutes from now, I might be thinking about history or
that's right, yeah,
thinking about chemistry, and so. But God doesn't think about one thing now and another thing later, and so on. He just sort of understands everything at once.
Exactly.
One infinite act of understanding. He sort of grasps the whole shebang, right? I mean, he doesn't have to think about things sort of in pieces or one at a time and so on. So with God,
right. And by the way, a lot of prior very eminent Catholic theologians, not the least of which is St. Thomas Aquinas, also grasped that point: is that God is simply present and he understands everything uniformly, and if in the human phrase, at once is a term we use, but it's the way God is just able to comprehend everything.
In fact, you say now you have a very interesting analogy here in your talk. Because I should explain that I'm looking at your PowerPoint slides as we're talking. So you point out that that for human beings in a way also have a higher way of knowing than animals, because animals just limited to sort of sense perception. But you say God gave us reason, and reason, you say on this PowerPoint, reason takes us beyond sensory perception, and so we have a higher way of knowing than animals, and God has a higher way of knowing than we do. And one of our ways of knowing, you say here, is that our reason allows us to understand that space and time are part of this four dimensions, even though we can't sense that. We can't. That's not something that we can sort of visualize or sense, but our reason tells us it's true.
This is true. Yeah, and in the beginning of the 20th century, everybody had the perception that time was completely different from space. So when Einstein came along, that was considered very, very radical. Now, a century later, everybody in physics is very comfortable with treating space and time together because we've gotten used to it. But what it did, the way the process took on, or the way it happened to humans, was that reason took one guy beyond sensory perception, Einstein, and maybe some others in those days, Lorentz, Fitzgerald, a few others. But with the reason thus taking us beyond sensory perception and helping us to use mathematics, it has now, a century later, become second nature to physicists to treat space and time together.
Right.
And that is progress of mankind. We're a lot better off than the guys back in the 17th or 18th century in that we have a new understanding of space and time that wasn't there in the time of Newton or any of those other fellows. Right.
And then you have this very interesting analogy when you're talking about beyond comprehension. So you talk about how we say sometimes, I know something but I can't explain it, and you give an analogy to the book Flatland. Maybe you could tell us about the book Flatland. It's a marvelous. That
is one of the most endearing books out there, but I think it's a major theological treatise. What happened was in 1872, a headmaster at a British school named Edwin Abbott wrote this book that was intended to teach his students, 7th, 8th graders, about geometry. And it does that really well. It's a lot of fun. To this guy who's a two-dimensional being, and his name is A Square, walks around in this two-dimensional flatland. And so the book is just plain fun, and you learn a little geometry, and you get some giggles out of it. However, in the second part of the book, he goes into a dream state, and a sphere comes to visit him. Okay. The sphere, of course, can bounce in and out of flatland as he feels like it. They do all kinds of things, and this guy, A Square, is thinking the sphere is some kind of god. He's some, the sphere says, no, we can all do this, we're three-dimensional creatures. And eventually...
The square lives in a universe where the space is just two-dimensional. It's
exactly so, yeah. Yeah, right.
And he only knows... The only thing he can perceive with his senses are sort of two-dimensional objects in his two-dimensional world. And then all of a sudden the sphere comes along. Of course, the sphere can't fit into the two-dimensional world, but it passes through it. And as it passes through it, all that the two-dimensional guy can see are circles, because when a sphere passes through a plane, all that's in the two-dimensional surface is a circle. The intersection of the sphere with the plane is a circle. So the two-dimensional guy just thinks this being is a circle that keeps changing in size, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And he can't imagine. He doesn't even know what three dimensions means, right?
That is the cornerstone of the whole story, and that is what makes it so interesting, because as we read the second part of this book, we follow a square, that gentleman in two dimensions, as he comes to grasp that there are higher dimensions.
Right.
And late in the book, he, a square, is trying to tell the sphere that there are higher dimensions than three, at which point the sphere boggles because he doesn't have that experience.
Right.
So the analogy just jumps right off the page at you, as the human reader, that says, quit laughing at this two-dimensional guy and think about how limited your own ideas are, your own perceptions, and the real universe that you are in. How much greater is that than your limited thought processes? Because you, dear reader, are just like a square. It's being introduced to higher dimensionality.
Right. So the higher dimensions are not, they're not. There's nothing irrational or unreasonable. I mean, they're perfectly consistent and make sense. It's just we can't. And suppose so we're like the sphere in the story. We can't visualize 4 or 5 dimensions, but the mathematician would say 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Any number of dimensions make equal sense. It's just we cannot imagine it. We can't visualize it because we're sort of trapped, like the two-dimensional fellow was trapped in his two-dimensional world and couldn't visualize 3 dimensions. We can't visualize higher. So we're all sort of trapped by our senses and our imaginations.
And every one of these things, your word trapped is very good. These are limitations that keep us from comprehending more.
So you use the word transintelligible and mystery. So maybe you could tell us what you mean by that.
Well, the first I heard the word transintelligible was from a very beloved priest friend who's now died, named Ernie Spittler, out of John Carroll University in Ohio. And he introduced me to the word, that it is something that it's true, but it's beyond the reach of your own mind. You cannot you can't really grasp it in a way that is convertible into expression. You cannot say what you're understanding.
It's hard to express in human words.
Yeah, right. Because it's impossible to express. That's why. Because
our words are also based on our direct experience.
That's right. Yeah. So, and whether your language is Chinese or English or Russian or anything else, the concepts are missing from the language,
right,
which denies you the ability to express it or convey it to anybody else.
Right. All our language is ultimately based on our everyday experience of things, which again is limited to 3 dimensions and to the way we perceive and experience time and space. And so that's why mathematics allows us to say things that we can't say in ordinary language, I guess.
Exactly right. Yeah.
That's what makes physics so hard for people.
Well, it's true. And once it clicks and you get used to handling multiple dimensions, then physics isn't so hard. But to an awful lot of people who cannot bridge over to that mathematical point of view, it is a very difficult subject. And
the word mystery you also use in this connection, that these things, you can say that these things which we can't imagine or intuitively grasp.
Well, so this is, I sort of grabbed that word or stole it from a lot of things that Christian mystics have said over the centuries. Pick anyone you want, St. Teresa of Avila, people going back many centuries and so forth. They comprehend, they have a link to understanding God. They do things that the rest of us can't do, and so we sit back and we call this a mystery. And it's a useful word for that very purpose, to express the idea of something that escapes our limited grasp.
Now let's get to St. Augustine, because you have in your
right.
talk, mention how St. Augustine in the year approximately 400 AD had some insights about God and space and time and so on. So could you tell us a little about that?
Sure. It's in either City of God or in Confessions in various different places.
Right.
But I think Augustine was the most underrated physicist in history because nobody thinks of him as a scientist. But it was around the year 400, and he was the first one to say that space and time were created together by God, and that he did that as one unit thing to begin creation, and that was the beginning of time.
Right.
The word before has no meaning in the absence of time. It's only another time word. After God created time that you could speak about before and after. Right. So the simultaneous creation of space and time, which God did, according to St. Augustine, that was a tremendous grasp, a tremendous advance. And he did it on the grounds of philosophy, not on the grounds of physics measurements or anything like that. So he really accomplished something with that. And what he also did was he showed in that one statement that God is superior to time and space. Remember, we've had human beings for 10,000, 100,000, however long years you want, that have always assumed that God exists out there someplace in space and in time, and Augustine swept all that away.
Right.
So
I mean, you said
he was
earlier,
a brilliant man.
Right, right. I mean, so I think, as I recall, that the pagans of his time would taunt Jews and Christians and say, because the pagans thought that time had always existed, there'd always been, there'd been infinite time in the past, and they said, why did your God wait for an infinite amount of time before he made heaven and earth? And St. Augustine said, you got it all wrong. Space and time are part of heaven and earth, as it were. They're created things. And so when God created heaven and earth, he also created time. And time started at the beginning of the world, was the beginning of time. So don't say... Well,
exactly right. Yeah.
There was no such thing as before time. And people sometimes say, before, in a time before time. It doesn't make sense. There's no time
That's right.
before God created time.
Yeah.
So
the sad thing about this was really that as brilliant as St. Augustine was in the year 400, throughout the Dark Ages and well up in the direction of the present, all this was forgotten. Newton came along and did classical mechanics and never once had the same insight that Augustine had.
It wasn't in the 20th century, right? It was with modern physics in the 20th century that...
St. Augustine was 1,500 years ahead of his time.
Right.
1,500 years.
The physicists then discuss, so St. Augustine says time is something created by God.
That's right.
He's not subject or bound by it. He's not living in time and space, but he created time and space. And the physicist says time and space are part of the universe. And so the modern physicist says time and space is just part of the physical universe. And so the beginning of the physical universe, which might have been at the Big Bang, was also the beginning of space and time. And so it's sort of saying the same thing as St. Augustine, but he said these are creatures, and the modern physicist says they're physical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, that's a really important connection. You see in the first words of Genesis, the word firmament is used. Well, what does firmament mean? I suggest it may mean the coordinate system. That is X, Y, Z, and T, time, and that there was nothing until God created, first and foremost, everything that exists also included that coordinate system. As we follow modern physics and relativity, we now know that the universe itself, the X, Y, Z dimensions, are expanding as the universe expands, and time is expanding too. And the whole thing began at a certain time, which we call T equals 0 and space equals 0 and so forth. And that was the creation. And we call it the Big Bang, but that's what God did.
Right. So modern physicists give a lot of credit to St. Augustine. In fact, in the 20th century, they look back and they're very impressed by the profundity of St. Augustine's view that of time. But modern, you point out in your talk that there are certain strains or trends or whatever you want to call them, fashions in modern, in contemporary theology, which see God as changing with time. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
I identified three big problems that come from this faulty perception about God and time. The foremost of them is probably the question of predestination, which began as an argument between Calvin and Luther way back 500 years ago. And the core problem is that how can God know the future without forcing the past? If he knows you're going to heaven, then doesn't he control your behavior now? And what's going on is that mankind is looking for the answer in the form of either or. Either God does this or he doesn't, etc. But the idea of a both and answer, that isn't familiar to people. It forces them to step up to a higher level of thinking, and it's a concession you have to make to God being smarter than you, is that God can know the future without forcing the past because of the way he is present to all time. And the only analogy I can think of for this that makes a little bit sense is straight out of Flatland, where you have this puzzle, this hard to comprehend thing in Flatland. It was, how do you understand what it means to say upward but not northward? A square couldn't do that.
When the sphere is trying to explain to the guy who's living in two dimensions that he's has a third dimension he can move through, then the square cannot conceive of that. He tries to imagine that third direction as lying in his plane.
Yep,
right. Imagine it being perpendicular.
It doesn't work. Yeah.
So you're saying that in some sense these puzzles arise because we're trying to imagine God as if he's just a being like ourselves in space and time, and that's not the way he is. But when we sort of try to make him in our own imaginations just another creature crawling around through space and time, then these theological puzzles arise, right? I mean, which are just due to our limited way of thinking.
Right. Because of our limited way of thinking, we impose these limitations upon God, or at least upon our understanding of God, and that gets us into trouble. Right. Now, another big problem that came about was the whole field called process theology. And if it sounds like I'm telling you that process theology is wrong, it's probably about right. Anyway, back when classical mechanics was really popular, that's in the end of the 19th century, everybody believed in determinism. Well, every scientist. And time was absolute, that's all there was to it, so forth. And everything was so determined in the perception of scientists of its day that the clergymen were in a real jam, because it seemed as though all you could do was sit there and wait for the particles to take their bounces off of one another, and inevitably things were going to go according to this deterministic way. In all of that, the presumption was that God exists within time, God is going to change in time, and indeed God is subordinate to time. Time is just there. Time is absolute. Right. Well, that's a real problem, and began with Alfred North Whitehead and went through several other people in the 20th century, and continued to think of God as changing in time. Right. And I'm saying very firmly that no, it is man's perception of God that changes, but that doesn't mean that God himself changes.
Right.
And I think that's another important thing.
I think there's a step to making God, to this idea that God is immersed in time and changes with time and is part of the process that's going on in the world, is a step back. It's a sort of going backward. It's not progress in theology. It's going back before St. Augustine's profound insights, and it's sort of it's sort of it's a regression, not an advance. But I think one of the problems here is that they tend to visualize God as a thing, like us, an object in space-time. Maybe it's better to think of God as a mind that grasps things, understands, because even human understanding, in a way, transcends space and time. I mean, we can, in our minds, grasp things about the future and the past.
That is, and I'll tell you, that I think is the origin of a lot of today's turning away from religion, the sort of atheism of convenience that people sometimes adopt. They are smart enough themselves, or mankind is smart enough, that we do have a certain level of understanding, and then people are holding God down at this lower level of understanding from the, pick one, 17th, 14th, 12th, 18th century. So they've got this ancient image of God, and they reject that because of their superior knowledge of the 20th, 21st century.
Right.
Well, no, it's no good.
The Christian view, at least in St. Augustine, 16 centuries ago, was much more sophisticated, and they sort of have a much cruder anthropomorphic notion of God. And they should go back and read St. Augustine.
That's right, yeah.
And then they would realize that actually that dovetails very much with the view of space and time that modern physics gives us, that St. Augustine and the traditional Catholic view of God and how he relates to space and time really dovetails very well with modern physics.
It does indeed.
We have to stop. I looked at the clock, and I guess our time is probably expired. But I want to thank you for this really marvelous talk you gave at our conference. And I think one thing that modern physics can do, it's expanded our imaginations to such a point that it allows us to break free of certain cruder ways of looking at things that kind of got in the way of understanding theological ideas properly. Is that people in the past were a little bit limited in their imaginations, or at least some people were limited, and that got them into theological puzzles, and trouble.
Yeah. One of the things that a lot of religious people do is they listen to the atheists make some claim that about God that is a claim by the atheists that is applicable to one of these images of God from long ago.
Which were images. They were always meant as symbolic. So, when God was never understood by Christians or Jews to be literally, an old man with a white beard sitting on a physical throne located in space. That was all symbolic and poetic imagery, but too many people took it literally, and whereas the real teaching of the church was
That's
much
true.
more sophisticated.
Yeah.
Much more. That God was outside space and time. God is not a physical being. He doesn't have a place. He's not sitting or standing. He's above, altogether transcends space and time. That's always been the teaching, and yet people got misled by these images, poetic images. One thing science can do is help us understand how our thinking is sort of boxed in or limited by our imaginations, and some people never get beyond these sort of images that sort of lead to trouble. Anyway, I guess this has been a marvelous. I think this was a marvelous presentation. I want to thank you for giving it at our conference. And
I'm certainly glad to have had the opportunity. It was a very fine conference at Notre Dame.
Yes, and people can go to our website of the Society of Catholic Scientists and read more about the conference and the various presentations and so forth. Thank you, Dr. Sheahen. Thank you very much for talking to me today.
Thank you, Stephen. It's been a pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.